black woman was just ordered to move to the back of the plane by a pilot who didn't ask her name, didn't check her credentials, and didn't think twice. He looked at her skin and made a decision. She didn't belong. He humiliated her in front of a full cabin, smirked like he'd won something, and walked away like it was nothing. But what he didn't know was that he hadn't just disrespected a passenger. He had just struck the one person who could take everything from him. This isn't fiction. It's what happens when arrogance meets the wrong target, when a man drunk on power pushes someone he thinks won't push back. He had the uniform, the title, the control of the cockpit. She had something else: the law, the receipts, and a calm fury built from a lifetime of being underestimated. By the time the wheels touched down, the entire flight crew would be scrambling. The airline's board would be in crisis mode, and the pilot would be in handcuffs. But how did it get to that point? And what made her hold her fire until it really counted? Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. What moment would have made you speak up? And if stories about justice, power flips, and quiet vengeance give you chills, like, subscribe, and follow along. This one's going to stay with you. The airport lounge buzzed with a low hum of business travelers, morning CNN updates, and the hiss of espresso machines grinding into motion. Lauren Bishop walked in with quiet precision, a tailored charcoal suit hugging her athletic frame and polished black Oxfords clicking softly on the marble floor. She carried a sleek leather bag over her shoulder and wore no name badge, no obvious rank, just the unmistakable air of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Her presence stirred a few heads, not because she was flashy, but because she moved like someone who'd spent a lifetime making high-pressure decisions without blinking. She approached the self-service bar, where coffee brewed steadily behind a brushed metal counter, scanning the selections with mild detachment. Before she could reach for a cup, a clipped, authoritative voice called out from behind her, sharp enough to cut through the ambient chatter. "Hey, can you get another pot going? That one's about empty." Lauren turned slowly. A tall, square-jawed man in a Meridian Air captain's uniform stood with his arms folded across a broad chest, his expression flat and commanding. 4 gold stripes adorned each shoulder of his pressed navy jacket. The man, Captain Grant Foster, didn't look at her the way a colleague might. He looked at her the way someone looks at a vending machine that's out of order. Minor inconvenience, vaguely disappointing. Lauren didn't respond immediately. She studied him with the calm of someone who had nothing to prove, but everything to remember. Her voice was even when she answered, "I'm not with lounge support." The line was simple, factual, delivered without a trace of hostility. But Foster's brow furrowed. His gaze dipped to her lack of a name badge, then back to her face. "Right," he said, more to himself than her, then added with a dismissive shake of his head, "Well, you're standing in their spot." She said nothing, only turned back to the counter and calmly poured herself a cup of black coffee. Behind her, Foster grunted and walked off, muttering something about protocols, to no one in particular. As his footsteps receded, Lauren exhaled quietly and stirred her coffee, her reflection warping in the curved steel of the carafe. She recalled her father's voice, that phrase etched into her memory from childhood. "You'll have to be twice as good to get half as far." The words weren't angry, just true. And as she turned away from the counter and made her way toward the east-facing windows of the lounge, she reminded herself that this moment, this insult, was nothing new. What mattered wasn't that it happened. What mattered was how she'd use it. Out on the tarmac, a line of white and silver aircraft gleamed under the Missouri sun, each awaiting its assigned crew. Lauren sipped her coffee and checked her watch, 7:12 a.m. Her flight, designated Meridian 479 to Washington, D.C., was scheduled to depart in less than 2 hours. She was not just a passenger. She was not just a captain. Today, she was flying in plain clothes, acting as an embedded civilian auditor for the DOJ's Aviation Compliance Division. It was a program designed to monitor systemic bias within elite transport lines, a program Lauren herself had helped create. And Captain Grant Foster had just stepped into it headfirst. When the gate agent paged her name, just her name, no rank, no honorific, Lauren returned to the desk and handed over her ID wallet. The young man behind the podium opened it, and his jaw slackened slightly. He stood straighter. "Right this way, ma'am," he said, voice strained with nervous professionalism. "The captain's already at the gate." Lauren nodded without acknowledgement and followed him down the terminal hall, her bag swinging lightly at her side. At gate 47A, Foster stood with his arms crossed and a scowl creeping into the edges of his mouth. He didn't recognize her, not yet. Not in this context. But the moment she stepped within 10 feet of him, the gate manager turned and said, "Captain Bishop, you'll be boarding directly through the forward hatch. If there's anything you need from the crew, let me know personally." Foster's head turned sharply. "Captain," he asked, blinking. His tone wasn't confrontational. It was confused, maybe even nervous. Lauren turned to face him fully, extended a hand, and said with perfect clarity, "Chief Lauren Bishop, Internal Audit, Justice Department." Foster didn't move. His mouth opened, then closed. A vein in his temple twitched. Lauren stepped aboard Flight 479 through the forward hatch with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to turbulence, whether in the sky or on the ground. The forward cabin was pristine, a study in minimalist luxury. Wide leather seats, brushed nickel fixtures, and ambient lighting that hummed softly overhead. Her assigned seat, 2C, was located just outside the cockpit door, a position usually reserved for flight tech evaluators, deadheading pilots, or VIP-level observers like herself. As she placed her carry-on into the overhead bin and slid into the seat, a young flight attendant with strawberry blonde hair and practiced poise approached her with a tight-lipped smile. Her name tag read Kayla, and her tone was flat when she said, "Excuse me, ma'am, we're going to need to move you." Lauren met her gaze calmly, one brow raised. "Is there a reason?" she asked, not moving. Kayla hesitated before answering. "There's a reported issue with the seatbelt mechanism. Maintenance flagged it an hour ago, but we didn't get the update until just now." Her words were polished, her smile unwavering, but something beneath the surface felt off. "You'll be more comfortable in 9E near the window," she added quickly, gesturing toward the back of the first-class section, one row from the divider curtain. Lauren didn't argue. She studied Kayla's body language, shoulders stiff, eye contact forced, then gave a slow nod and stood. As she moved to her new seat, the air shifted. People watched, not with curiosity, but with a kind of smug awareness that they were witnessing someone getting put in their place. Lauren ignored them and stowed her bag beneath the seat in front of her, sliding in with the grace of someone who had nothing to prove. She fastened her seatbelt and adjusted the ventilation knob overhead, then glanced casually to her left. A man in a silk tie and expensive watch was already pretending to be asleep beside her, though his phone screen was still glowing in his lap. She turned her attention forward, unfazed. The cabin continued to fill as boarding concluded. The last of the passengers squeezed into overhead bins and took their seats, and the crew secured the main cabin. Kayla passed through once more, pausing briefly near Lauren. "Would you like a drink before takeoff?" she asked with a sugary tone that barely masked something sharper. "Water's fine," Lauren replied, but Kayla had already turned away. Moments later, a second flight attendant approached, a dark-haired woman with narrow eyes and a clipboard in one hand. She crouched beside Lauren's row, balancing a half-filled cup of coffee in the other hand. As she leaned to retrieve a checklist from the seat pocket in front of Lauren, the cup tilted, splashing a streak of steaming brown liquid across the edge of Lauren's carry-on bag. "Oh my gosh," the attendant gasped, drawing the attention of several nearby passengers. "I'm so sorry, that wasn't supposed to happen. I'll grab napkins." She rushed off, leaving Lauren holding her soaked bag, the heat of the coffee barely cooled by the chill of the cabin. Across the aisle, someone murmured, "Some people can't handle coffee and class at the same time." Another voice chuckled in reply. Lauren didn't react outwardly, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. The attendant returned with a wad of napkins and began patting the seat and armrest without acknowledging the bag. "We'll get this cleaned up," she said, not quite making eye contact. "Maybe next time, try to keep your bag under the seat in front of you, not beside it." Lauren said nothing. She took the napkins and began wiping her bag herself, slowly and methodically, as the hum of whispered commentary drifted from the row behind her. To the average eye, it looked like a clumsy mistake, maybe an unfortunate incident. But Lauren had served in federal task forces, worked undercover in hostile zones, and spent over a decade decoding manipulations far more sophisticated than this. This wasn't carelessness. It was orchestration, subtle, plausible deniability wrapped in a series of small humiliations. She glanced toward the cockpit. The door had closed. Foster was in position, and though the seat was reclined and the lighting low, she was almost certain she saw the side of his mouth twitch in what could only be described as a smirk. It was brief, almost imperceptible, but Lauren had seen men like him use that smirk to start wars. 10 minutes after takeoff, the overhead chime rang twice. A voice, calm and authoritative, came through the speaker system, just loud enough to pierce the quiet of the cabin. "Passenger Lauren Bishop, please report to the cockpit for an urgent matter." I repeat, Lauren Bishop, forward cabin. The tone was civil, almost gentle, but the intent beneath it was unmistakable. Heads turned, eyes followed. A businessman across the aisle lifted his brows, his curiosity barely veiled. The flight attendants didn't move. They didn't need to. The message wasn't for them. Lauren stood slowly, brushing her blazer smooth with one hand, her face unreadable. Her stride was even as she moved past Rose, though she could feel the weight of silent judgment pressing against her shoulders. At the front, Kayla gestured toward the cockpit without a word, her smile stretched tight as piano wire. Lauren entered. The door closed behind her with a soft but final hiss, the hydraulic seal locking her inside a confined space where the rules, physical and psychological, suddenly shifted. The cockpit was dim, lit only by the glow of digital panels and the soft pulsing of altitude indicators. Captain Grant Foster sat in the left seat, his posture rigid, but casual enough to convey dominance. Beside him was First Officer Eric Noland, younger, quieter, his expression carefully neutral. Foster didn't rise. He simply turned his head toward her and gestured vaguely to the fold-down jump seat against the wall. "Have a seat," he said, voice flat. Lauren remained standing. "You called me." Foster nodded, a mockery of formality in the tilt of his chin. "Yes, we had a flag on your manifest. Something didn't line up during the cross-check. Name, purpose of travel, position. I figured we should clear it up sooner rather than later." His tone remained polite, but Lauren heard the current beneath the words. Challenge disguised as protocol. She folded her arms instead of sitting. "And you decided to bring me into the cockpit mid-flight, without notifying your crew lead or consulting security procedures?" Foster's smile thinned. "It's not standard, I'll grant you that. But when something doesn't feel right, I trust my instincts." Nolan shifted slightly in his seat, but said nothing. "You boarded this flight out of uniform," Foster continued. "You occupied a cockpit-adjacent seat typically reserved for credentialed personnel, then were moved for technical issues." He paused, giving her a theatrical glance. "And I still haven't seen any form of official ID." Lauren didn't blink. "That's because I haven't offered it." Foster's jaw tensed for a beat. "Then let's make it simple. Show me your credentials, or I'll be forced to log a potential security concern." His tone hardened as he added, "You know how serious those reports are these days." For the first time, Lauren stepped closer. She didn't reach for her wallet. She didn't raise her voice. She simply looked him in the eye and said, "Captain Foster, if you think for one second that I don't know exactly how serious false reports can be, then you haven't done your homework." Her voice was quiet, but each word hit like the slow tightening of a vice. "And if this little stunt is your way of reasserting control, you're going to regret wasting this opportunity on theatrics." Nolan coughed gently, eyes flicking between them. "Sir," he said carefully, "if there's no procedural directive here, maybe we should return to flight ops. We're running a stable course." Foster didn't answer immediately. His hand hovered above the flight logbook as if debating whether to document something real or imagined. After a moment, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled through his nose. "Fine. Consider it informal. You can return to your seat." Lauren didn't move. She looked at Nolan, then back at Foster, and with a single motion, drew a small, leather-bound wallet from her inner blazer. She flipped it open and held it at eye level. The gold DOJ insignia gleamed under the cabin lights, flanked by her name and title. Chief Inspector, Department of Justice, Aviation Oversight Division. Neither man spoke. Not even a breath. Lauren waited another 3 seconds, then snapped it shut and slid away. "Now that we've cleared that up," she said, her voice edged with frost, "I suggest you focus on flying the aircraft instead of playing gatekeeper." She turned and opened the cockpit door herself, stepping back into the cabin without ceremony. As she walked down the aisle, the same eyes that had followed her rise now shifted with a new energy, uncertain, cautious, perhaps even a little afraid. But Lauren didn't flinch. She returned to her seat, adjusted her belt, and leaned back, her heart steady, her mind sharper than ever. 25 minutes after she left the cockpit, the cabin speakers crackled to life again. This time, the voice was unmistakably Foster's. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for choosing Meridian Airlines. As a reminder, if you notice any passengers attempting to access restricted areas or impersonate federal personnel, please notify a crew member immediately. Your safety is our priority." His voice was measured, deliberate, delivered with the ease of routine protocol. But Lauren felt the bar buried inside it, sharp and specific, designed not to accuse her directly, but to plant doubt, to stain her presence with quiet suspicion. A few passengers shifted in their seats. Some looked around as if uncertain who the announcement referred to. Others turned their eyes to her, subtle but unmistakable. Foster had sent his message. "You may have credentials, but I control the narrative here." Lauren didn't react. She didn't flinch, didn't scan the room for allies, didn't engage in damage control. Instead, she adjusted the air nozzle above her seat and leaned back slightly, drawing a slow breath. There was power in stillness, especially when your opponent mistook it for submission. A few minutes later, the crew began beverage service. The cart rolled through first class with quiet efficiency, sparkling water, wine, a curated menu for passengers who paid extra for exclusivity. When the tray reached Lauren's row, Kayla stood just a bit too tall and smiled just a bit too wide. "Unfortunately, ma'am," she said crisply, "we don't have your meal listed in the upgraded system. Looks like you didn't select your preference in time." Lauren replied evenly, "I pre-selected a Mediterranean vegetarian option and confirmed it twice, once at check-in and again at the lounge." Kayla consulted her tablet with exaggerated effort. "I'm not seeing it," she said with a faux frown. "Maybe you were booked under a different tier?" She lowered her voice, not in discretion, but in performative sympathy. "Sometimes the company upgrades employees or auditors to first class, but their meal plans don't follow. I can check again after we finish the cabin, but I can't guarantee anything." Lauren pulled her boarding pass from her jacket pocket, unfolded it with precision, and held it just long enough for Kayla to read the seat number, the designation, and the priority executive stamp at the bottom. "Paid in full. Priority reservation. Booked by federal contract." Kayla smiled again, tight, condescending. "I'll see what I can do," she said, then pushed the cart forward without taking the pass or offering a water bottle. The passenger beside Lauren, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and a discreet pearl brooch, leaned slightly toward her without turning. "I don't know what you did to them," she whispered, "but they're trying awfully hard to make you invisible." Lauren gave a faint, dry chuckle. "I'm used to it," she replied. "This just happens to be a more creative version." 2 rows ahead, someone laughed too loudly at nothing. Lauren recognized the voice, the man from the lounge who had smirked when she was moved. He leaned toward another passenger and whispered something behind a cupped hand. Lauren didn't hear the words, but she saw the glance that followed, direct and sour, aimed at her. Then the smirking man spoke aloud, loud enough to rise above the hum of the cabin. "You know, it's wild what people will pretend to be just to get into first class these days. I mean, throw on a suit, flash a badge, suddenly everyone thinks you're FBI." Laughter followed, uneasy but real. Lauren felt the knot form at the center of her chest, not from offense, but from confirmation. This wasn't passive exclusion anymore. This was the performance of power. Him using his privilege, her presence being mocked as fiction, their assumptions tightening into a net of groupthink. Foster's plan wasn't just to inconvenience her. It was to dismantle her legitimacy piece by piece, so that when the real confrontation came, no one would believe her story had ever started in truth. But what Foster didn't understand, what he couldn't, was that Lauren didn't need his belief. She didn't need anyone's. She only needed their words, their reactions, their patterns. And they were giving them to her freely, arrogantly, assuming that silence meant defeat. She looked down, took out her notebook, and began writing, not angrily, not with vindictive urgency, but with surgical intent. Every interaction now seemed coordinated, as if the crew and a handful of passengers had silently agreed on an unspoken narrative. She didn't belong, and they would reinforce that until she either erupted or disappeared. She gave them neither, but the structure they built around her was beginning to buckle under its own arrogance. The man seated across the aisle, mid-40s, business casual, the type who always looked like he was on his third conference call of the day, shifted in his seat and glanced at her notebook. His eyes lingered longer than necessary. "You're very thorough," he said, a forced smile on his lips. Lauren didn't look up. "Comes with the job." The man chuckled dryly. "Guess that's why Foster was so worked up earlier. Said someone was trying to pull rank who didn't deserve it." Lauren's gaze lifted slowly. Her pen paused in midair. "When did he say that?" The man shrugged. "Back in the lounge. I heard him talking to another captain. Something about people trying to bluff their way into first class, calling them badge flashers, airport actors." He laughed and said, and I quote, "Women like that should be inspecting luggage, not walking near cockpits." Lauren nodded slowly, her expression unreadable, but her pulse quickened. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. That one slip of arrogance, whispered casually by a man who didn't even realize he was revealing systemic rot, had just handed her something better than proof. It gave her the tone, the culture, the context. Word spreads quickly in confined spaces. A passenger 2 rows ahead shifted uncomfortably. A woman behind her stopped her quiet conversation and leaned slightly forward, pretending to adjust her air vent, but clearly listening now. The ripples had begun. People were still silent, still complicit in comfort, but the seeds of uncertainty had been planted. Not everyone would take Foster's narrative at face value anymore. The illusion of control was cracking. As the captain announced their initial descent into DC, the lights in the cabin dimmed, and crew members moved down the aisles for final checks. Lauren tucked away her notebook and straightened in her seat, glancing toward the front of the cabin. That was when Kayla appeared again, her expression tighter now, eyes gleaming with forced authority. "MS. Bishop," she said in a voice meant to carry, but sound composed, "I'm going to have to ask you to step up toward the forward galley during final approach." Lauren frowned slightly. "Why?" Kayla held up a tablet. "We received a compliance notice that a bag near your seat triggered an alert during loading. We need to secure the space near you as a precaution." Lauren narrowed her eyes. "You want me to stand near the door while the plane lands?" Kayla's smile was polite cold. "Just until we can verify the luggage doesn't match any flag profiles. Standard procedure in anti-terror protocols." A hush fell over the surrounding rows. No one said anything, but the air felt heavier. The words anti-terror hung like smoke, vague, unproven, but enough to shift perception. Lauren stared at her for a beat too long, then unbuckled her belt and stood. She walked with silent composure toward the front of the aircraft, past the closed cockpit door, stopping just short of the exit hatch. She stood there alone, hands folded before her like a statue carved from restraint. The flight attendants gave her space not out of respect, but out of calculation, distance cloaked in faux professionalism. She was now a visual message, the passenger under scrutiny, the unspoken other, removed from her seat not for disruption, but for projection. It wasn't just about humiliating her. It was about creating a performance for the passengers. One that said, "See, we were right about her." Lauren glanced sideways and saw Foster through the small window of the cockpit door. He wasn't flying, autopilot handled that now. He was watching, not overtly, just barely, through the crack in the door's blind. His mouth curled slightly in the corner, not into a smile, but something meaner. Lauren returned her gaze forward, her jaw locked tight, her fingers flexing slowly at her sides. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't policy. This was orchestration, rehearsed prejudice draped in procedure. And she let it happen, because they were still giving her more than she ever could have taken by force. Witnesses, reactions, patterns. As the wheels touched down and the plane jolted softly against the runway, she remained steady, unmoving. The passengers watched from behind their seatbacks and their quiet judgments, but a few now watched with uncertainty, with questions in their eyes. The narrative was bending. The moment the wheels touched down and the aircraft began taxiing toward the terminal, Lauren remained standing exactly where they had placed her, beside the emergency exit like a prop in someone else's play, a symbol of supposed vigilance, staged for the benefit of watching eyes. The other passengers sat still, some murmuring quietly behind raised newspapers or under hushed breaths, unsure of whether they were witnessing protocol or something more insidious. But Lauren knew what it was. It was a final act of humiliation, a symbolic exile, the culmination of an hour-long campaign to strip her presence of authority, to break her composure with layered degradation masked as regulation. And Foster, still seated in the cockpit, was waiting for the curtain call, the final blow that would cement his sense of dominance. As the aircraft rolled into position and the seatbelt sign chimed off, the cabin lights shifted to their full brightness. Lauren remained composed, her spine straight, her arms at her sides. Then the cockpit door opened and Foster emerged. He didn't stride out. He didn't speak immediately. He paused just long enough for the front rows to register his presence. Then, in a voice that was just loud enough to carry 3 rows deep, he said, "As a reminder, unauthorized presence in restricted flight zones is a federal offense. Passengers lingering near the cockpit without proper cause may be detained upon deplaning." The words weren't directed at Lauren by name, but every pair of eyes in the surrounding seats turned toward her with quiet anticipation. He had said everything without saying her name. Again, Lauren turned to face him. She took one deliberate step forward, closing the gap between herself and the man who had spent the past 90 minutes trying to dismantle her. Foster saw her approach and smirked. It wasn't a smile of victory. It was the smirk of a man who believed the threat had passed, who thought she was making one last futile gesture before boarding bridges and final goodbyes swept it all away. "You again," he said dryly. "You people are persistent." Lauren's voice remained calm. "You should be careful how you end this, Captain." Foster laughed aloud, drawing glances from several nearby passengers. "End this," he repeated. "I'm not the one who started pretending to be something they're not." The moment hovered, the tension thick and coiled, ready to snap. And then Foster said the line that broke the air open. "If you're law enforcement," he said with a scoff, "then I must be the second coming of Christ." He chuckled, loud and dismissive, expecting more laughter from those behind him. None came. The passengers were silent. The atmosphere had shifted, turned dense, crackling with anticipation. Lauren didn't flinch. She simply held his stare. Foster, agitated by her stillness, stepped closer. "I'm talking to you," he snapped. "You think that badge, or whatever fantasy you're living, gives you the right to disrupt this crew, this flight?" When she didn't respond, he took one more step, close enough now that his voice dropped to a warning. "Don't make me escort you out myself." Lauren didn't move, and Foster, fueled by ego, misunderstanding her silence for fear, lifted his hand and struck her across the face. The sound echoed through the cabin like a gunshot, sharp, immediate, final. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned. The woman in seat 2A gasped audibly. A man 3 rows back stood halfway, frozen mid-reach for his briefcase. The attendants didn't move. Even the hum of the jet's auxiliary power seemed to hush. Lauren's head had turned slightly from the force of it, but she didn't stumble. She slowly turned her face back to center, met his eyes, and, without a word, reached into the inside pocket of her blazer. From it, she withdrew a slim leather wallet, flipped it open, and held it chest high. "Lauren Bishop," she said, voice even. "Chief of Police, City of Chicago." For a full 3 seconds, no one spoke. Then a male passenger muttered from behind, "Oh my God." Another whispered, "Did he just hit a police chief?" The ripple started at the front and rolled backward, disbelief crashing like surf through the cabin. Lauren held her position, badge still out, as Kayla finally approached from the side, her eyes wide with shock. "Ma'am, Chief Bishop," she stammered, but Lauren raised a hand calmly. "Secure the cabin. Detain the captain until federal authorities arrive." Her voice remained flat, steady. "You are no longer under his command." Foster staggered a step back. "Wait," he began, reaching out as if to explain, to grab back some version of control. But Lauren didn't give him the chance. She turned her head slightly toward the cockpit door. "First Officer Noland," she called, clear and precise. "Is the flight log current?" There was a pause. Then Nolan stepped out slowly, nodding. "Yes, ma'am. Fully updated. I saw what happened." His voice was quiet but resolute. Lauren nodded once. "Good. You'll be filing the initial report." She didn't look at Foster again. He had already started to tremble. Foster stood frozen, his outstretched hand slowly curling into a fist that trembled not from anger now, but from exposure. The performance was over. The audience had changed sides. And just as the weight of reality began pressing down on the captain's shoulders, Lauren turned slightly, her gaze sweeping the cabin until it landed on a man sitting inconspicuously in seat 4C. A man who had barely moved since boarding, who had kept his earbuds in and eyes lowered like any forgettable traveler. But when she gave him the signal, a single nod, sharp and precise, he stood. He was tall, clean-shaven, early 40s, and when he moved, it was with the quiet efficiency of someone trained to be noticed only when necessary. As he approached the front, he removed one earbud and slipped a badge from inside his jacket, flipping it open just enough for the nearest flight attendant to read it. "Special Agent Derek Ames, Federal Aviation Security," he said, his voice calm, steady. "Per Regulation FAA 67-14, I am requesting the immediate detainment of Captain Grant Foster for assaulting a federal officer and obstruction of in-flight federal investigation." The words struck harder than the slap. Several passengers audibly gasped. Kayla stepped back instinctively. A younger flight attendant dropped a pen. Foster took one step backward, bumping into the bulkhead wall, his face pale and glistening with sweat. You can't do this," he stammered, eyes darting between Lauren and the agent. "This is overreach, it's political. Hell, it's entrapment." Lauren turned toward him at last, eyes sharp but composed. "You assaulted an officer mid-flight. You mocked a federal position in front of a full cabin. You orchestrated a campaign of targeted harassment. The only thing that's overreached here is your ego." Foster's mouth opened to protest again, but Agent Ames held up a slim, black digital recorder. "This device has been running since boarding," he said. "Cabin audio, ambient microphone, and synced to cabin comms. We have your voice, your statements, and your actions, every word of it." The color drained further from Foster's face as the reality of surveillance, evidence, and jurisdiction set in. Then, unexpectedly, another voice entered the moment. A voice aged by years of practice, low but sure. It belonged to the senior flight attendant, a man in his early 60s named Russell, who had remained mostly silent throughout the flight, moving with quiet dignity, never drawing attention. He stepped forward now, meeting Lauren's eyes before glancing toward Foster. "We've documented complaints about Captain Foster for years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but resonating like thunder in the dead air. "Hostile behavior, intimidation, targeted bias. We reported them. HR buried them. Legal stalled them. But those of us who've flown with him, we knew it was only a matter of time." His eyes flicked toward the passengers, who now sat in a state of quiet revelation. "You did what none of us could," he added softly. "You held him accountable." Lauren inclined her head in acknowledgement, her voice equally quiet. "You all held the line. You endured. I just brought daylight." Agent Ames nodded and stepped forward. "Captain Foster, per FAA Authority and Justice Department Directive, you are hereby suspended from command and placed under federal hold pending transfer to airport authorities." Foster backed further into the wall, looking as if he might bolt or faint. But the agent moved quickly, producing a slim set of flex cuffs and securing Foster's wrists behind his back. No one stopped him. No one defended Foster. Not this time. The people who had watched Lauren be moved, silenced, insulted. Those same passengers now watched a man who had weaponized authority be stripped of it, badge by badge, word by word. As Ames escorted Foster down the aisle, heads turned in quiet disbelief. The smirking man from earlier looked away. The woman with the pearl brooch gave a single, approving nod. And the businessman who had once echoed Foster's mockery sank deeper into his seat. Kayla moved wordlessly toward the intercom, her face tight with fear and confusion. Lauren stepped beside her and said, "Patch me to terminal operations. I'll coordinate the handover myself." Kayla obeyed, and the tone in her posture had changed, not deference out of rank, but respect earned through truth. Outside, the jet bridge extended slowly, and through the forward window, Lauren could see a small team of uniformed airport officers waiting. The sun had begun to set, casting a long beam of light through the glass, landing directly at the cabin door. Less than 48 hours after the incident aboard Flight 479, headlines across the country lit up with the same name that once commanded respect in high-altitude circles, Captain Grant Foster. But now, that name carried a different kind of gravity. Words like assault, abuse of power, and racial profiling flooded media outlets as the footage, the audio logs, and the first-hand testimonies collected from passengers, crew, and one relentless chief of police forced the airline into full-scale damage control. Lauren didn't linger in the media spotlight. She had never been interested in optics. While reporters clamored outside the Justice Building and pundits debated whether her response had been too aggressive or admirably restrained, she sat behind closed doors in a cold-lit conference room in Washington, D.C., staring at a digital file labeled Meridian Internal Compliance Restricted. The contents were worse than even she expected. Over the next 3 days, Lauren, flanked by Agent Ames and a small DOJ task force, uncovered years of buried complaints tied not just to Foster, but to the internal leadership structure that had enabled him. The first red flag appeared in a 2017 grievance submitted by a junior flight attendant named Celia Tran. According to the archived report, Celia accused Foster of coercion, claiming he threatened to ruin her career unless she complied with certain off-hours expectations. She had even provided partial evidence, messages, photos, a hotel keycard mailed anonymously to HR. But the investigation had been dismissed due to insufficient corroboration, and Celia had been reassigned to regional routes before resigning 2 months later. Lauren's jaw clenched as she read it, knowing now that Foster's confidence aboard 479 hadn't come from isolation. It had come from protection. Next came the pilot training logs. Dozens of irregular entries marked with fast-track certifications for trainees linked to personal associates, golf buddies, former military contacts, even a godson. One entry stood out. A 22-year-old with no log simulator hours signed off for co-pilot privileges during a Chicago-Denver route. The instructor's initials? G.F. Lauren cross-referenced the schedule manifest and found that Foster had been captain on that flight. He was building a boys' club inside the cockpit, she muttered, sliding the file toward Ames. Not just building it. He was gatekeeping it, molding it in his image. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst was buried beneath legal settlements. Dozens of non-disclosure agreements signed over the past decade with employees who had either alleged racial discrimination, harassment, or retaliation. One former technician, Miles Garnett, had sued after being denied promotion 5 years in a row despite spotless performance. His settlement had been sealed, his record buried. But Lauren found the notations. Every time someone spoke up, she said, the company threw money at silence instead of addressing the rot. By the end of the 4th day, Lauren had compiled a 32-page federal brief outlining not only Foster's misconduct, but the systemic structure that had allowed it to thrive. She titled it, High Altitude, Low Standards, an audit of institutional bias in commercial aviation. And she wasn't done. She called a meeting with the airline's executive board, insisting it be held in person and off-camera. When she stepped into the glass-paneled boardroom, the room was filled with crisp suits, hollow apologies, and scripted damage control. The CEO, a man with snow-white hair and a PR smile, opened the meeting with, "Chief Bishop, thank you for bringing this to our attention. Rest assured, Captain Foster does not represent who we are as a company." Lauren didn't smile. She opened the folder and slid copies of the brief to every person at the table. "Yes, he does," she said evenly. "Because you let him. Because every report that came across your desks was met with silence, deflection, or a payout. Because you thought bad behavior at 35,000 feet didn't leave a paper trail. But now it has." A silence settled over the room, one born not of shame, but strategy. She could see the questions forming. What could be denied? What could be rebranded? What could still be hidden? But Lauren pressed on. This is not just about one man losing his job. This is about overhauling a culture where abuse masquerades as protocol and where loyalty is given to rank, not to truth. When one board member, a woman in her 50s with a nervous tone, asked, "What are you expecting from us exactly?" Lauren answered without pause. "A full, independent investigation. Real reform. The firing of every executive who approved the burial of these reports. And public acknowledgement. Not an apology, not a press release, but real accountability. Or I take this brief to Congress and call for a federal hearing on commercial aviation ethics. Your choice." The fallout from Lauren Bishop's federal brief didn't dissipate. It detonated. Within 72 hours, every major news outlet from CNN to The Atlantic picked up the headline, not as a passing scandal, but as the foundation for a broader cultural reckoning inside an industry long protected by altitude and pedigree. But what made the story endure wasn't the viral footage, nor the arrest of Captain Grant Foster. It was the unexpected clarity and structure of Lauren's response. She didn't just expose a broken system, she designed a new one. While executives scrambled to revise policies and sever ties with anyone named in her report, Lauren met with the Department of Transportation, FAA, and representatives from pilot unions in a closed-door summit that would quietly reshape how the country viewed not only flight safety, but the human biases flying the planes. She presented a program titled Implicit Altitudes, recognizing unconscious bias in flight protocols, but the media would rebrand it under the simpler, more piercing moniker she had used offhand during the meeting. Prejudice doesn't have to shout. The title stuck. Within weeks, it was adopted as the national baseline training for all commercial flight crew certification renewals. Not everyone welcomed it. There were protests from veteran pilots, op-eds decrying the policy as political theater, and quiet resistance from within smaller, privately owned airlines. But the weight of public pressure, combined with the elegance of the program's design, made it impossible to dismiss. It was rooted not in shame or blame, but in pattern recognition, neuro-response mapping, and de-escalation under bias exposure. It didn't accuse pilots of being racist. It asked them to recognize the flight path their instincts followed, and to choose better. Lauren wasn't interested in becoming a spokesperson. She turned down network interviews, declined book deals, and ignored brand partnership offers. What she accepted instead was a rare invite to testify before Congress. Closed session first, then public. Her prepared statement was only 4 minutes long. "Bias in aviation isn't always loud," she said into the microphone, her voice calm, her hands folded. "Sometimes it's as soft as a seat reassignment, a withheld meal, an unanswered call button. But when you stack 1,000 small denials together at 35,000 feet, you build a system that quietly dehumanizes. My job isn't to punish that system. My job is to interrupt it." The room was still. Reporters scribbled furiously. Senators leaned forward. When she finished, one aide whispered, "That's going to become legislation." And it did. 2 months later, Congress passed the Aviation Personnel Accountability and Psychological Evaluation Act. Its unofficial name quickly replaced by what was printed on the brass plaque outside the chamber: the Bishop Clause. The law mandated semi-annual psychological evaluations for pilots and flight attendants, including modules on stress response, implicit bias, and ethical boundary management. More controversially, it required anonymous peer review mechanisms, allowing crew members to report misconduct without going through their direct chain of command. Airline lobbyists pushed back. Some unions threatened to strike. But public opinion held fast. This wasn't reform for headlines. This was a recalibration. Lauren watched it all unfold from a distance, returning to her duties in Chicago without fanfare. She resumed her post as chief of police, turned down a proposed Senate run, and declined to license her likeness for a streaming dramatization. She didn't need to own the story. She had already lived it. What mattered to her was watching it replicate, watching other industries begin to examine their own sealed cabins of privilege and bias. Within a year, 3 other major sectors, rail, hospitality, and federal security, launched parallel review systems based on her model. In airports across the country, posters began to appear in crew lounges. You are cleared for takeoff only when your judgment isn't flying on autopilot. It became an unofficial slogan. And in classrooms at aviation academies, instructors taught case studies not just in airspace violations or emergency protocol, but in human dignity. Lauren never walked into one of those classrooms. 365 days after Flight 479, the name Grant Foster resurfaced in the national conversation, not as a footnote, not as a cautionary tale, but as a felon. The trial had not been televised, but it had been covered. The prosecutors had relied not only on video and audio evidence, but on a string of testimonies from former employees, passengers, and flight crew who, freed by the weight of Lauren Bishop's precedent, finally spoke with clarity and without fear. The courtroom wasn't dramatic. Foster had pleaded not guilty at first, his attorneys painting him as a scapegoat in a hyper-politicized climate. But the momentum had already turned. Witness after witness recounted incidents long buried. Microaggressions, intimidation, casual threats delivered behind cockpit doors. By the 3rd day, even the most skeptical jurors had begun leaning away from the defense table. On the 7th, Foster changed his plea to guilty on 3 counts: assault on a federal officer, abuse of authority in a regulated transport environment, and engagement in race-motivated discriminatory conduct. The sentencing judge, a former Air Force colonel with deep roots in aviation law, delivered the verdict with measured weight. "You had thousands of feet beneath you," she said, "and still you chose to look down on the people beside you. That is not command. That is cowardice." The courtroom remained still as she sentenced him to 3 years in federal prison and permanent revocation of his aviation license, followed by mandatory psychological rehabilitation. Foster didn't speak at sentencing. He didn't offer an apology. And when reporters attempted to capture a statement from him during transfer, he said nothing, his eyes down, his lips drawn into a line too thin to be anything but denial calcified into silence. In prison, he became what he had always feared being: a man without control. No uniform, no cockpit, no false audience to impress, just concrete order and the company of men who had no interest in his former rank. He was assigned kitchen duty. He didn't protest. He watched the world through a 12-inch window in the common room, his days measured by meal trays and news broadcasts. And that's where he saw her again, on screen, standing behind a podium at the International Summit on Aviation Ethics, held in Geneva, Switzerland. The camera didn't need flair. It captured Lauren in her element, composed, focused, her words simple but precise. She didn't mention Foster. She didn't need to. Instead, she spoke about systems, not individuals, about dignity, not retaliation. Justice, she told the Assembly of Global Regulators and Flight Executives, isn't about vengeance. It's about the restoration of truth. And when institutions fail to deliver that, people lose altitude, until someone dares to pull the yoke. Her speech was met with a standing ovation, not just from diplomats and executives, but from young cadets, minority aviators, and advocacy groups who had flown in from 5 continents to be part of the shift she had set in motion. Foster watched it unfold with the detachment of a ghost in daylight. He couldn't look away, but he couldn't recognize the world anymore. Not the rules, not the symbols, not the power structure he once navigated with smug ease. In Chicago, a mural had been painted on the outer wall of the city's largest aviation training academy, a stylized image of a woman standing on a runway, her shadow stretching into the silhouette of a badge and wings. It bore no name, but everyone knew who it was. "Integrity leaves no turbulence," read the caption in bold beneath it. The mural had been commissioned not by city officials, but by students, those who had read the reports, studied the case, and redefined what it meant to lead with accountability in high places. Lauren didn't visit the mural. She didn't attend unveiling ceremonies or accept awards. She simply returned to her post each day with the same purpose she'd carried aboard Flight 479. Observe, document, act. Quietly, precisely, without compromise. And in doing so, she became something larger than a title. She became proof that dignity, when held, could dismantle arrogance faster than any uniform ever could. In his final week before transfer to a lower security facility, Foster received one piece of mail, a photocopied page from a training manual distributed to every new Meridian pilot under the Bishop Clause. The page was marked with a yellow highlighter over the final paragraph. Aviation is not just physics and protocol. It is stewardship. You are not only flying an aircraft. You are flying responsibility. No signature. No return address. He read it twice. Then he folded it, slid it under his cot, and stared at the floor. The end. If this story struck a chord with you, let us know what moment hit the hardest. Was it the slap? The courtroom justice? Or the quiet power of dignity reclaiming its voice? Drop a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to know how far this message travels. And if you want more stories where power is challenged and truth rises to the surface, don't forget to like and subscribe. More is coming. Stay tuned.